There is a watch in a drawer somewhere that nobody is wearing. Not broken, not ugly. Just finished. The brand name on the dial used to mean something. Now it means nothing. Those brands no longer matter, and that's the story this video is actually about. Number 10. Daniel Wellington. Walk through any airport in 2016 and you couldn't miss them. Slim case, leather strap, NATO strap, clean white dial. The word Wellington sitting just above 6 o'clock, like it belonged there. Daniel Wellington didn't build a watch brand. He built a social media campaign that happened to include watches. The Swedish company launched in 2011 with $30,000 and a vision that had nothing to do with horology. The founder, Philip Tysander, named the brand after a British traveler he met in Australia. There was no Daniel Wellington. There was no heritage. There was a name that sounded like it had been around since the 1800s and a Miyota quartz movement you could buy off a shelf for a few dollars. For a specific moment in time, that was enough. Interchangeable straps, clean design, Instagram-friendly photography. They sent watches to influencers before influencer was a job title. At their peak, they were selling somewhere around 200,000 watches per year. A generation of 20-somethings wore them without ever wondering what was inside. Then the moment ended. Minimalist quartz watches were a trend, not a category. Once the look became everywhere, it became nowhere. By the early 2020s, the same aesthetic was available for $9 on Amazon. The brand that was built entirely on a feeling couldn't survive when the feeling moved on. Retailer interest cooled. The influencer partnerships that had fueled early growth became expensive and harder to measure against actual sales. The movement inside a Daniel Wellington doesn't age well. Neither does the brand equity around it. Somewhere, someone opened a drawer, saw this watch, looked at it, and put it back. That was a brand built to look like a watch company. The next one actually was one, until it decided that being a fashion accessory paid better. Number 9. Fossil. In 2014, Fossil Group's revenue was $3.2 billion. They owned or licensed something like 30 fashion watch brands: Emporio Armani, Michael Kors, Kate Spade, DKNY. If it had a logo and a quartz movement, Fossil was probably making it. They weren't pretending to be fine watchmakers. They knew what they were: fashion timepieces, accessible prices, broad distribution. That model worked for 2 decades because there was no serious competitor in that price range doing anything different. Then the Apple Watch arrived in 2015. Fossil tried. That's the thing people forget. They genuinely tried to adapt. They threw hundreds of millions of dollars at smartwatch development. They built Wear OS watches. They acquired startups. They pivoted and repivoted. None of it worked. The core problem wasn't that Fossil failed to build a good smartwatch. It's that their customer, the person who wanted something on their wrist that looked nice and showed the time, had 2 better options by 2018: a smartwatch from Apple or Samsung, or an entry-level mechanical from Seiko, where $150 actually bought you something with a movement you could open up and watch tick. Fossil sat in the worst possible position: too expensive to compete on price with fashion jewelry, too simple to compete on function with tech, too shallow to compete on craft with real watchmakers. By 2023, their stock had dropped over 90% from its peak. Store closures across their retail footprint, the licensed brands gradually moving toward in-house production and away from the Fossil relationship. The company they'd built by aggregating fashion brands was coming apart in exactly the same sequence it had been assembled. The cruelest part? Their own watches weren't the problem. The category they dominated just ceased to exist. The mid-tier fashion watch market evaporated, and they evaporated with it. The layoffs came quietly. Hundreds of jobs across their design and distribution operations. Retail partners began reducing floor space. The licensed brands, the Michael Korses and Emporio Armanis, that Fossil had been manufacturing for years, started exploring whether they needed a middleman anymore. Some of them decided they didn't. A buyer who spent $200 on a Fossil in 2013 probably still has it. It probably still runs fine. But they wouldn't buy another one. Not because Fossil let them down. Because the world moved on and the space Fossil occupied in it quietly closed around them. Fossil lost a category war. The next brand lost something harder to explain. It lost the right to the story it was telling about itself. Number 8. Benrus. Let's talk about earned credibility. Benrus watches appeared on the wrists of American soldiers in Vietnam. The US military issued them under contract. Triple-sealed cases, shock protection, military spec. There are photographs from the late 60s of soldiers in the jungle with Benrus on their wrist, right next to their rifle. That's not marketing, that's history. The original Benrus Watch Company, founded in New York in 1921, genuinely built service-ready watches during that era. Their military-grade pieces from the 60s appear at auction today for several hundred to several $1,000s. Serious collectors know what they are. The modern Benrus is a different company entirely. It uses the name. It uses the military imagery. The website is full of language about heritage and durability, and quiet references to the Vietnam-era legacy. They produce watches styled to look like they've been through something. Subdued dial colors, canvas straps, tactical aesthetic. But the watches are contract assembled. The movements are off the shelf. The connection to the soldiers who actually wore Benrus in 1968 is purely cosmetic, the brand name and the color palette, nothing more. This matters because the people who buy Benrus watches in 2026 are often buying what they believe is a piece of genuine military history, a line of continuity running from those jungle photographs to whatever they've strapped to their wrist. That line doesn't exist. There's a thread on Watch You Seek that shows this clearly. The moment you start asking Benrus about their movement sourcing, their manufacturing relationships, their actual production chain, the answers stop being specific. The story gets vague. It doesn't survive direct questions. The vintage Benrus? Genuine. Worth hunting. The modern Benrus? It's wearing a uniform it didn't earn. At least Benrus has the decency to look the part. The next brand built something genuinely iconic and then let one idea become its entire prison. Number 7, Shinola, Detroit, 2012. An abandoned industrial building, a watchmaking operation being assembled from scratch, with workers trained specifically for the job. Machines imported from Switzerland. A story about American manufacturing, about reviving a city, about watches made by people who needed work. It was a beautiful story. It was also, in parts, not entirely true. Shinola, named after a vintage American shoe polish brand, did open a manufacturing facility in Detroit. People there did assemble watches. That part is real. What was harder to see clearly at the time? The movements came from Ronda, a Swiss supplier. The components weren't American-made. What happened in Detroit was assembly and quality control, not manufacturing in the traditional sense. The Federal Trade Commission took issue with early "built in Detroit" marketing, and Shinola adjusted their language accordingly. To Shinola's credit, they never claimed the movements were made in Detroit once the scrutiny arrived. But the brand's entire emotional proposition, the thing that justified paying $300 to $500 for a watch with a sourced Swiss movement, rested on the manufacturing narrative. When that narrative got complicated, the price justification got complicated with it. Collector forums weren't kind. The watch community, which values transparency around movements and manufacturing, perhaps more than any other enthusiast group, felt misled. Not because Shinola made bad watches, the quality control was genuinely decent, but because the story that made them worth the price was built on a foundation that didn't hold. There's something specifically painful about a brand that was supposed to represent authenticity being caught in a question about authenticity. The whole value of Shinola wasn't the watch, it was the idea of the watch. Once you puncture the idea, $300 for a Ronda movement in a nice case is a harder sell. They've survived by diversifying into leather goods, bicycles, and audio equipment. The Detroit story still works for buyers who either don't know the history or have decided they don't care. But in collector circles, the conversation about Shinola always reaches the same point. What are you actually paying for? Nobody has a fully comfortable answer, and that discomfort is permanent now. A brand's reputation in collector circles is like a credit score. It takes years to build and one news cycle to damage. Shinola built theirs on a story. When the story got qualified, the reputation got qualified with it. The watches didn't change. The price tags didn't come down much, but the thing that made a buyer feel good about paying those prices got a lot harder to hold on to. Shinola's story fell apart when people asked too many questions. The next brand's story is simpler and sadder. They had the real thing. Then they traded it for scale. Number 6. Movado. Here is what Movado actually built in its early years. A Swiss company founded in 1881, La Chaux-de-Fonds, canton of Neuchâtel. They produced watches that appeared in museum collections. Their calendomatic, their early work in perpetual calendars, their miniaturization achievements. These weren't fashion pieces. They were technical accomplishments that serious collectors sought out across decades. In 1947, a New York Museum of Modern Art curator named Nathan George Horwit designed a watch dial. Single gold dot at 12 o'clock. Nothing else. No markers, no numerals, no text. He called the concept the sun and the moon, the dot representing the sun at noon, the hands moving around it. Movado adopted that design in 1961. They called it the Museum Watch. It entered the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. One perfect design. That's not nothing. That's genuinely significant. But Movado built an entire company around a single idea from 1947. The museum watch became the Movado identity. Department store placement, Macy's. Nordstrom. The glass case near the cosmetics counter. Prices in the $200 to $800 range. Gift purchases. Anniversary watches. The kind of watch you buy for someone when you want to spend real money but don't know what you're doing. The movement inside most modern Movados is a Swiss-made quartz, not ETA, not Sellita. Usually a basic ISA or similar caliber. You're paying for the case, the dial, the dot, the name. For collector circles, this is the Movado tragedy in its cleanest form. They had the provenance. They had the archive. They had decades of genuine technical achievement, work that sits in museum collections, work that horologists actually studied. And they methodically repositioned every bit of it into a department store proposition that attracts exactly zero serious horological attention. It's a choice, not a catastrophe. Movado made a business decision. The museum watch sells, department store real estate works, and the gift market is reliable. That's defensible. But there's a cost. The collector, who might have spent 10 years discovering the depth of the early Movado catalog, who might have become an evangelist for the brand's real history, never shows up. Because the modern Movado sends no signal to that person. It says, anniversary gift. It says, I spent something real but I didn't know what I was doing. The early Movados show up at auction. People who know the history buy them, quietly, for prices that don't reflect what they actually are. The modern ones sit in glass cases next to the perfume. They do fine there. They just have nothing to say to anyone who cares about watches. Movado gave up the archive for the department store. What comes next never had an archive to begin with. Just a founding myth that turned out to be more complicated than the price tag suggested. Number 5. Invicta. The founding date is 1837, and it was founded in Lausanne, Switzerland. Rache & Cie, producing watches for the European market. That history is documented. The name Invicta appeared on Swiss movements through the 19th and early 20th centuries. There are vintage pieces with genuine Swiss craftsmanship sitting in private collections right now. Then the quartz crisis hit, and the company struggled. And in 1991, the name and assets were acquired. The operation moved to Hollywood, Florida. What happened next is one of the more remarkable repositioning stories in watch history. Remarkable not for its quality, but for its scale and audacity. The modern Invicta is a marketing engine. Their Pro Diver line sells on Amazon and on television shopping channels for prices that fluctuate wildly based on whatever sale is running. A watch listed at $350 sells for $49. A watch listed at $800 sells for $75. The retail price is a fiction. It has always been a fiction. Consumer advocacy groups have documented the practice. The FTC has historically scrutinized fictitious pricing strategies in retail. The kind of manufactured discounting that Invicta's TV sales model was built on is precisely the pattern that draws that scrutiny. The part that complicates everything, the Pro Diver is not a bad watch. The Seiko NH35 movement is reliable and proven. The case quality at the actual sale price, $40 to $70, is competitive. If you buy it knowing what you're buying, it's fine. The problem is the mythology around it. Invicta markets the 1837 Swiss founding date prominently. Someone who doesn't know watches buys one for $80, thinking they're getting something connected to a 180-year-old Swiss manufacturer. They're getting a watch assembled with Japanese movements by a Florida marketing company that bought a dead Swiss name. The original Invicta ended. What replaced it borrowed the headstone. Invicta bought a Swiss history and sold it back as an American deal. The next brand didn't buy a history, it was a history, one of the biggest in American manufacturing. And it still couldn't survive. Number 4, Elgin. At the peak of Elgin's production, they were turning out over 1 million watches per year. Let that number find its proper scale. In the 1890s, when every component was machined, finished, and assembled in a factory complex in Elgin, Illinois, that covered over 1 million square feet and employed thousands of workers. The Elgin National Watch Company was not a small player in American manufacturing. It was one of the structural anchors of it. Their watches went into railroad cars. The rail industry's demand for accurate timekeeping built American watchmaking, and Elgin was one of the companies that met that demand at industrial scale. A railroad-grade Elgin from the early 1900s, properly maintained, will still keep time today within seconds per day. That's not nostalgia. That's engineering. The company ran for over a century. They fought through 2 world wars, diversified, eventually moved into electronic components during the mid-20th century as the watch division weakened under competition from Swiss and Japanese producers. The watch operation closed in 1968. The factory complex was demolished. What replaced it was not a revival. It was a lease on a name. The Elgin name passed through multiple owners over the following decades, each using it to label watches that had no connection to anything that happened in Illinois before 1968. Today, an Elgin watch is a brand name owned by a holding company. The watches are contract assembled. The name that once meant industrial precision and railroad reliability now means this thing tells time and doesn't cost much. The people who know what Elgin was don't buy modern Elgins. They hunt for the originals at estate sales and auction sites, where a genuine Elgin movement in good condition can still be found for $40 to $150. Real horology. Available because almost nobody left knows what it is. Somewhere in a house in the Midwest, there's an Elgin pocket watch that came down through 3 generations. The great-grandmother who received it as a gift in 1923, the grandfather who carried it every day of his working life. The adult child who inherited it and put it in a drawer, not sure what to do with something this old, this specific, this entirely disconnected from the brand name they see on Amazon. The family doesn't know what they have. That might be the saddest sentence in this whole video. Elgin's name outlived everything that made it worth saying. Waltham's story rhymes, but with one detail that makes it even harder to let go of. Number 3. Waltham. Before Elgin, before Hamilton, before any of them. The American Watch Company was founded in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1850. It was the first to successfully manufacture watches using fully interchangeable parts, produced by machines, not individual craftsmen building individual pieces. Machines producing standardized components that could be assembled, repaired, and serviced without custom fitting each part. This was the application of American system manufacturing applied to watchmaking. Waltham did it first, in 1850, in a factory on the banks of the Charles River. Their movements powered the American rail network through its most dangerous era of expansion. Their quality grades through the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s were certified by the railroad companies themselves, who had zero tolerance for inaccuracy. To these companies, 2 minutes slow meant 2 trains on the same track. A Waltham railroad-grade movement had to meet published accuracy standards before it could be sold as rail-approved. That standard was real, and tested, and consequential. They also made watches for the British Royal Flying Corps in World War I. Pocket watches that went up in open cockpit biplanes over the Western Front. Waltham developed an 8-day clock movement used in early aircraft instrumentation. This was an industrial company contributing to the actual mechanics of modern warfare. The factory finally closed in 1957. What happened after that is the kind of story that makes you feel the weight of historical distance. The Waltham name went to multiple licensors across the following decades. What it labels today has no production connection to anything that happened in Massachusetts before 1957. The movements are generic. The cases are imported. The only continuity is typographic, those 6 letters, same as they always were, on a dial that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who ever worked in that factory. Vintage Walthams aren't expensive. A movement from the 1890s in solid condition, $50 to $200 at estate auctions. The railroad grades. The military pieces. The early examples of American precision manufacturing. Available, affordable, and largely unknown to anyone browsing past them at an estate sale, who sees an old pocket watch and thinks, nice, but it's not for me. The gap between what Waltham was and what the name now labels is perhaps the single cleanest example in this entire video of what no longer matters actually means. It's not that the brand is disgraced. It's that the connection between the name and the thing the name once represented has been severed so completely that the name now gestures at nothing real. Which of these have you actually heard of before today? Drop it in the comments. I am genuinely curious where people's starting points are. Waltham's name survived, but its meaning didn't. The next brand situation is entirely different. It's not a name on an empty vessel. It's a ghost still haunting something alive. Before we move on to the next part, let me tell you this. Most people don't realize this, but buying a watch the wrong way can cost you thousands, and you won't even notice it until it's too late. You walk into a store or browse online, and everything looks the same, but behind the scenes, there's a system. Prices aren't always fair, availability is controlled, and one bad decision can leave you overpaying for something that doesn't even hold its value. That's why I created a complete free insider guide to buying watches. Inside, you'll find the best watches to buy, the watches to avoid, and how to choose a watch that actually fits your style and budget long term. The goal is simple. I'll help you stop guessing and start buying smart. You'll find the free guide in the pinned comment and description. Now, let's move on to the next part. Number 2, Lemania. You know the Omega Speedmaster, the moon watch. The watch that went to the moon in 1969 came back and has been on Omega's wrist ever since. It sells today for something approaching $5,000 to $8,000, depending on configuration. What you probably don't know is who made the movement. The Lemania Watch Company, founded in 1,884 inches, Lorient, Switzerland, was not a consumer brand in the way we think of brands. They were a movement manufacturer. A company that existed to produce the mechanical engines that other, more famous companies would put in their cases and sell under their own names. The Lemania Caliber 321 powered the original Speedmaster, the one on the wrists of Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. The Caliber 321 was a column wheel chronograph, an architecture considered mechanically superior because column wheel mechanisms have fewer potential failure points than the alternative cam lever design. NASA didn't need a watch that looked impressive. They needed one that wouldn't fail at 200,000 feet. They chose the Caliber 321. Lemania's movements also appeared in Patek Philippe, in early Breguet pieces, in military chronographs supplied to the British and French armed forces. If you have a serious mechanical chronograph from the mid-20th century and you open the case back, there's a genuine chance the caliber inside says Lemania, or was based on a Lemania architecture, even if the dial says something else entirely. By the 80s, the company was under Swatch Group control. The name eventually ceased to function as a standalone entity. Today, Lemania's legacy exists in Breguet's movement architecture and in Omega Heritage editions that revive the Caliber 321. The brand itself, gone. But here is what collector forums keep returning to. Lemania never needed you to know its name. It was always the name behind the name. The movement that made the famous movement famous. The kind of company that exists in the watch world as a ghost you can only see if you know to look, inside a caseback, stamped on a bridge, in a reference number from 1962. There are Lemania-signed pieces. Watches produced under the company's own name, mostly for military contracts and private clients, without another brand's label on the dial. A Lemania-signed chronograph from the 60s or early 70s will cost you somewhere between $3,000 and $12,000, depending on condition. Less than the Speedmaster. More than almost anyone realizes it should be. The irony is that Lemania's invisibility is precisely what made it valuable. A company that never needed to be famous outlasted most of the consumer names it supplied. Omega is still here. Breguet is still here. The Lemania architecture is inside some of the most expensive watches in the world. The name is just gone. The ghost is still ticking, just quietly. Lemania disappeared into history, and the movement survived it. What comes next didn't disappear. It came back. And that might be its most complicated chapter yet. Number 1, Universal Genève. In the early 50s, a young designer named Gérald Genta received a commission from Universal Genève. He was not yet famous. He would later design the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak and the Patek Philippe Nautilus, 2 watches that now sell at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Before any of that, he designed the Universal Genève Polarouter. The Polarouter was built for SAS, Scandinavian Airlines System, for the pilots flying polar routes in the 50s, the first commercial flights over the North Pole. The watch needed a micro-rotor, which would sit within the movement's thickness rather than sweeping over it, allowing an ultra-thin profile without sacrificing automatic winding. Universal Genève's micro-rotor Polarouter was one of the most technically sophisticated watches of its era. Elegant. Functional. The kind of object where form and purpose arrive at exactly the same answer. That was 1955. By the 70s, Universal Genève was in serious trouble. The quartz crisis didn't discriminate. Heritage didn't insulate you. The company struggled through various ownership structures across the late 70s and early 80s. By the mid-80s, the brand had effectively ceased meaningful operation. For roughly 40 years, Universal Genève existed as a name, a memory in collector circles. Vintage Polarouters and Compax chronographs appearing at auction, bought by the people who knew what they were looking at. Prices for those original pieces climbed steadily as awareness grew. A Polarouter in good condition by the 2010s was worth several $1,000s among collectors who understood what Genta had built before he was famous enough for anyone to care what he'd built. Then, in 2023, Breitling's parent company acquired Universal Genève and announced a revival. In 2026, the first new collections are arriving. New Polarouters, referencing the micro-rotor heritage. New chronographs, a living brand again, with a Geneva address and a team and a strategy. Here is the question that nobody in the watch community has a clean answer to. Can you revive a heritage you didn't earn? The people at the new Universal Genève didn't design the Polarouter. They didn't make the Compax. They weren't in Geneva in 1955 when Genta was working out the micro-rotor geometry. They acquired the name, the archive, the right to say founded 1894 on the dial. The craftsmanship they reference happened 70 years ago in a company that has no operational continuity with the company using the name today. Is that heritage? Or is it archaeology with a marketing budget? The collector community is genuinely split. Some argue the archive is real, the reference numbers are real, the design language is real, and a well-executed revival that honors those originals is legitimate. Patek Philippe didn't manufacture the same watches in 2024 they made in 1940. Brands evolve, references change, what matters is the commitment to craft. Others argue something harder to dismiss. The romance of Universal Genève for 40 years was precisely that it was lost, that a brand only 60 collectors cared about had an intimacy, a purity, a resistance to commercialization that was itself part of the value. Reviving it might produce technically excellent watches while destroying the specific thing that made those 40 years of dormancy feel meaningful. The Polarouter is available again. The micro-router spins again. Gérald Genta's design language is being referenced in Geneva workshops by watchmakers who genuinely care about getting it right. Whether the result is heritage or expensive nostalgia is a question the next decade will answer. Somewhere, the collector who bought an original Polarouter in 2019 for $3,000 because he understood what Genta had built before Genta was famous is watching the revival unfold from a particular vantage point. He's still wearing his original. He hasn't decided yet what he thinks about the new ones. The brands in this video didn't all fail the same way. Some were killed by economics. Some were bought and hollowed out. Some hollowed themselves out voluntarily, trading depth for scale. Some are asking to be trusted again after years of silence. What they all share is simpler: the gap between what they were and what the name currently means. That gap is the whole story. If you've got a watch in a drawer with a name from this list on the dial, drop it in the comments. The vintage ones are almost always more interesting than they look. I'll see you in the next video. Like this one and subscribe. The guide in the pinned comment is the shortcut to understanding watches. It is for you to not only look good, but not even overspend in some cases.